Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Evan Kersey, and I'm an associate at SCS Global in the food labeling program, and I'll be presenting some general information about gluten-free certification through SCS, and today we'll be talking about especially avoiding cross-contamination and testing in your plant once you have achieved certification. So before we get started, I just wanted to cover a few logistics. First of all, everyone attending the webinar is muted, so we will not hear you if you speak up. So if you have any questions, just please put them in the chat box as they come up, and I'll do my best to answer them probably just during the 15-minute Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if we aren't able to get through all those questions at the end, we'll make sure to follow up after the webinar to get those questions answered in writing to you. And the webinar is being recorded, so we'll be emailing it out to you tomorrow. So let's just go ahead and get started. So here's the agenda. We're going to be going through some general information first before we get to avoiding cross-contamination and testing, which we'll spend some time on that near the end of the webinar. But first I'll provide an overview of SCS and the services we offer, then we'll go over the gluten-free standard, including the organizations behind the standard and why the claim's important, and then we'll go over in some depth the audit and inspection process, because I think a lot of people are interested in how that works. And that'll start from when you initially contact SCS to the day you receive your certificate. I'll also provide some information about the actual gluten program and the difference between a gluten program and an allergen control program. Then I'll explain some information about ingredient risk levels, and I'll review the definitions of risk levels with you and provide some examples. And then we'll jump into ways to avoid cross-contamination, which will include several slides on common sources of cross-contamination and additional ways to mitigate risk, and testing requirements and testing methods. And we'll review when and what we need to test. And then we'll wrap everything up with, a 15 or 20-minute Q&A, depending on how much time we have. And our food labeling program manager, Lucy Anderson, will be joining us as well to help field some of those questions. So first, just a little bit about SCS, our company background. We're a third-party certification body located in California Bay Area with satellite offices all around the world, and we've been a global leader in environmental and sustainability certification, auditing, testing, training, standards developments for over 35 years. And SCS programs span across industries, recognizing achievements in green building, product manufacturing, food and agriculture, forestry, and lots of other things as well. So our mission is to stimulate outstanding environmental stewardship and social responsibility. So as you can see, we're actually headquartered in Emeryville, California, but we have satellite offices and representatives all around the globe working with us. And here are some examples of the services we offer, including major GFSI benchmark certifications like SQF, BRC, FSSC, 22K, Global Gap, and Primus GFS. And we have sustainability services such as USDA Organic, Sustainably Grown, Non-GMO, Gluten-Free, Fair Trade, USA, and several more things as well. But today we're just going to be focusing on gluten-free. So let's jump into it. Tell you a little bit of background about gluten-free certification and the standard. The Gluten-Free Certification Organization is the entity that developed and maintained the standard and scheme for the certification of gluten-free products. And GFCO is a program of the Gluten Intolerance Group, otherwise known as GIG, of North America. And the certification is based in the evaluation of products, their ingredients, and then we audit policies, procedures, records, documentation of the manufacturing facilities, You'll hear me use the word plant in place of the word facility. Basically, we just use those two terms, facility and plant, interchangeably with gluten-free. And the standard and other scheme requirements are described in the GFCO scheme manual, which can be provided by our sales manager, Ned Hallaby, whose contact info will be provided at the end of the presentation. And one important thing to know is that GFCO is the largest and fastest growing gluten-free certification organization in North America. So why is this important? Why do we get the claim? And one of the main answers is that celiac disease is an autoimmune disease triggered by gluten proteins. And the level of diagnosis of celiac disease in 2014 was 1%. But it was, estimated more around 4%, and there's just a huge growing awareness among consumers regarding just a general healthy diet and a diet without gluten containing products, and the impact of those gluten products on their health. Great, so let's jump into the audit and inspection process. So first, kind of give you a little background for scoping reasons. We basically classify production plants by risk, and we've broken those into three classes: low risk, medium risk, and high risk. So low risk is a dedicated gluten-free facility and packaging only operation with dedicated gluten-free equipment. And a medium risk facility is a mixed use facility, meaning there's gluten-free and gluten-containing production. However, there's no shared equipment, and gluten-free production is completely separated by a physical barrier from any gluten-containing productions. And a high-risk facility is going to be the same thing. It's going to be a mixed-use facility. However, there will be gluten-free productions and gluten-containing productions run simultaneously without any physical barriers, or it could be a plant where equipment is shared for gluten-free and gluten-containing production. So those are kind of just the general three breakdowns that we have for scoping. If you have a low-risk plant, you'll be charged a lower amount because the risk is lower. And let's go over the audit process. I think a lot of people want to understand exactly how long the audit takes and what the exact steps are. So initially, you'll contact us and we'll have you complete the participant information form. Then we will provide a quote, send you a work order based on the scoping based on that form. Then we'll have you sign a professional service agreement, or we'll have that agreement. And then once you pay, we'll send you an onboarding gluten-free certification program email. So this is basically what we call kind of an initial documentation request. We'll send a product and ingredients information form where you'll list out all gluten-free products that you want to produce and all the ingredients in those products. There's also a facility profile, which will include your plant's process flow diagram, the gluten program, segregation and cleanout procedures, and written SOPs for selecting materials and vendors, labeling incoming materials, corrective action procedures, traceability procedures, things like that. So we like to collect that information before we do the on-site inspection, just so we can have a good idea of the activities and the procedures taking place in the facility, and we can ensure a smooth site inspection. Then there is the inspection preparation, which is basically just the time the participant has to provide documentation from that documentation request and then prepare for the inspection. And then we will schedule the inspection. So basically the auditor is going to reach out to the participant, come to an agreement on a date, and the auditor will then provide the inspection plan, which basically includes the time frames, and the different things that we will be going through during the site inspection. Once we complete a facility on-site inspection and address any nonconformities that come up during the site inspection, you receive your certificate. So basically, after the inspection, if there are any nonconformities, you will receive a report listing out all those nonconformities. And actually, at the end of the site inspection, the auditor is going to go through all those nonconformities with you, and you'll have a period of time to essentially resolve all those nonconformities, submit further documentation, update your procedures, etc. And then once those things are resolved, if necessary, then you will receive your product certificate. So that's the general audit process. Now, to go in a little bit deeper on the process and the actual site inspection, as we said, we schedule the audit, and then when we get there, we conduct a short opening meeting, and then we usually spend a large chunk of time just going through your documentation, making sure that all your written SOPs are in line with the GFCO standard. Then we may interview some management or workers, and then we'll do a walkthrough. And actually, usually the interviews may take place during the walkthrough, and then after that, we'll conduct a closing meeting, at which time we'll basically lay out all the findings that arose during that site inspection. And we'll also, if it's an initial audit and you've never performed a test before, then we'll actually do an example run of a test. We'll grab an ingredient or product from your facility and just kind of show you how to perform the test. And then, as I said before, we'll report NCs. We'll describe those in detail. And then as after any NCs that have arisen are resolved, a certification decision will be issued. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the gluten program, what the gluten program is. And it's basically, it's a collection of written procedures in place that address gluten control. And it doesn't necessarily need to be named the gluten program or be an isolated procedure. For example, it can be incorporated into an existing allergen control program if that makes more sense for your operation. It's really up to you if you want to build up your own gluten program or actually incorporate it into an existing program or into your existing SOPs. So the gluten program is their policies and procedures that name and specifically address gluten and its risks. And all plants used to complete gluten-free manufacturing steps must be covered by these policies and procedures. Regarding the actual difference between a gluten program versus an allergen control program, many manufacturers treat gluten as an allergen, but only wheat is considered as one of the big 8 allergens by the FDA. So a lot of manufacturers who handle gluten under their allergen procedures, for the gluten, they actually must specify that their program covers all the major allergens and the main sources of gluten, which are wheat, barley, and rye. So that's really the main difference, is that the gluten program requires that you specifically refer to those sources of glutens apart from wheat, so it will need to include barley and rye as well. And the plants must manage gluten and all its sources, not just wheat as the allergen. So this is really the main difference between, a typical allergen control program and a gluten program. Let's talk a little bit about ingredients and the risk levels per the standard. So GFCO has developed 5 different risk levels for ingredients. And risk level 1, basically these ingredients have no perceived risk for use in gluten-free foods. So this would, for example, fats, oils, chemicals, or anything else that does not contain protein. And then risk level 2 ingredients that have a low risk for use in gluten-free foods. Ingredients in this category include items that may share some part of the supply chain with gluten-containing grains. So an example here might be something like spices. Risk level 3, these ingredients have a moderate risk for gluten cross-contamination because they commonly share some part of the supply chain with gluten-containing grains. So something like quinoa or quinoa flour or rice flour, or some kind of seeds, grains, things like that. For risk level 4, there is a high risk for cross-contamination because they share one or more steps of the supply chain with gluten-containing grains. So something like oats would be a risk level 4 ingredient. Risk level 5 are ingredients that actually are gluten proteins from wheat, rye, barley, or some related grains. There are several of those. And these are just strictly prohibited from use in certified products. So let's get into avoiding cross-contamination. So there was just some general things that I wanted to go before I provided some examples of sources of cross-contamination. First of all, the standard requires written procedures that cover preventing, identifying, and reporting instances of gluten contamination. Um, so these written procedures, they're going to have to be made available at all critical control points where contamination may occur in the plant, and staff is going to have to be trained annually on the procedures, how to identify and report potential instances of contamination. Um, Finished product testing will validate the effectiveness of procedures and prevent release of non-conforming product. So depending on the plant, ingredient and equipment testing may also be required. And finally, SCS will audit on site that your written procedures and policies are compliant with the standard and confirm procedures are correctly carried out during the plant walkthrough and employee interviews. So I think what I'm trying to communicate here is that if you do achieve certification, you're going to have written procedures in place, and we're going to audit, your employees and your facility to make sure that there is very, very little chance of contamination, and there's a fail-safe, which is the testing, which will basically locate any problems for that. So let's go over some potential sources of cross-contamination. Some of the main ones are at receiving, when you're receiving raw materials, if a incoming shipment is contaminated with something, mislabeling and mispackaging of materials or finished products, improper segregation, if any visitors and employees bring anything into the facility or aren't observing proper hygiene, that could cause some cross-contamination. And equipment may be contaminated in mixed-use facilities, especially. So when you're receiving raw materials, you'll be required to visually inspect and sign off on all incoming trucks and shipments. And you'll want to confirm, it's actually a standard requirement that you need to confirm raw materials are from approved vendors and labeled in such a way that they are uniquely identified and cannot be confused with other material or material lots. And quarantine or segregate raw materials that are identified as a potential source of contamination is also a requirement. For segregation, you're going to have to ensure proper segregation during receiving, storage, and production. So basically, the entire through the entire production, receiving, storage, and production. Gluten-containing and gluten-free materials should be stored in separate rooms or on separate shelving. At a minimum, gluten-free materials should be stored above gluten-containing materials. And gluten-free works in progress must be covered or kept separate from gluten-containing works in progress. And if dust is an issue in the facility, there has to be some kind of mechanism or equipment to contain that dust to prevent cross-contamination. Cleaning and equipment contamination. So regularly cleaning schedules are absolutely essential for maintaining a gluten-free production environment. And this includes cleaning between production of gluten-containing and gluten-free product, if applicable, if you are using the same lines for doing gluten-free and gluten-containing productions, and methods for verifying the cleaning process or facilities, equipment, and work tools during production and packaging. Also, sequencing gluten-free production runs prior to gluten-containing runs will significantly reduce the contamination of risk. So this isn't necessarily a requirement, but it's definitely recommended. Mislabeling of and mispackaging of ingredients or finished products is also a big potential source of cross-contamination. So the plant should always have an accurate list of certified products matching the product ingredient list on file with SCS and GFCO to avoid mislabeling. And the plant should identify risk points for gluten contamination, which I refer to as critical control points, or critical control points where product misidentification in their processes with plant diagram or written description of the production process. So one of the first things we ask for during the audit is that plant diagram, and we'll ask you exactly where all the critical control points are in the plant yeah, exactly. So another source is the people entering the facility. Uh, it can be introduced by anybody entering the plant. So everybody who has access, whether visitors or employees, anybody coming in is going to have to observe hygiene requirements. And all employees, maintenance workers, contractors, visitors, they must observe these requirements. And this includes, per the standard, includes hand washing, clothing requirements, food handling procedures. All of this is going to eliminate cross-contamination. And here's just some additional tips is you can actually reduce the risk level of your facility by dedicating it to gluten-free production. That's definitely not an option for everybody. I understand that. One thing you could also do is also reduce your plant risk level by eliminating any shared equipment. You can incorporate physical barriers between gluten-free and gluten-containing production lines and dedicate those lines to one or the other. And then as I was speaking to earlier, sequencing production. So gluten-free production always, takes place on certain days or always prior to any gluten-containing productions. So you might want to do your gluten-free productions in the morning, gluten-containing production in the evening, and then you can do a complete clean out and then start again the next day. That's just going to significantly reduce any chance of contamination. And another option is purchasing ingredients from your suppliers that are actually already GFCO certified. So that means that they're already doing ingredient testing on those, and it's basically a sure thing that those aren't going to be a source of contamination. And of course, you can always do further training, more testing than what's required by the standard. We encourage, frequent trainings, educating employees on these sources of contamination, the risks of gluten, things like that. Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit more about testing. So we're going to initially request a list of products and ingredients to submit for gluten-free certification. And GFCO will send that list to GFCO, and they then assign a risk level to each ingredient before we come and do the site inspection. So I referred to those 5 risk levels before. Each of your ingredients is going to be assigned to one of those 5 risk levels. And as your testing of ingredients is going to be based on those risk levels. And your testing plan is going to be provided by SCS when certification is granted. and it's going to be based on your gluten-free, your plant's operations, and also those ingredient levels. The frequency of providing those test results is quarterly, so we'll be sending out basically reminders emails telling you that you need to submit those. So here are the different things that may or may not need to be tested: ingredient, equipment, products, and in certain cases, if you're selling grains or as finished products, you may need to do a visual examination of finished products. And here is a very general breakdown of testing requirements. The main takeaways are that any ingredients that are risk level 2, 3, and 4 will require some level of testing if used for gluten-free production in dedicated gluten-free plants or mixed-use plants. And also for products, there is always going to be some level of product testing required no matter what. It may be as little as 1 quarter, and that also is just going to be dependent on the plant's operations. Only mixed use operations require equipment testing. And as I mentioned before, only for intact whole grain seeds, beans, pulses, and legumes. When they're sold as finished products, there is a visual and examination requirement for those as well. Now here's a general kind of breakdown of the different testing methodologies or methods for your products and ingredients equipment. For products and ingredients, you can use a GFCO approved test kit and perform the tests in-house on your own, and then provide those test results to us. Or you can, if you'd rather have those tests done in an accredited laboratory, that is fine as well. You'll just have to send those samples to a ISO 17025 accredited laboratory for testing. And also for equipment, same thing. You can either use a generic protein swab. You cannot use ATP swabs for GFCO, or you can also use a GFCO approved test kit, just like for your products and ingredients. And great, so that's the end of the presentation. Now we can open up the floor for questions. And my program manager, Lucy Anderson, is here to join us. So please, if you just have any questions, please put those in the chat box and we'll be happy to answer them as they come in.
Okay, so here's a question. What specific test method do you suggest for ingredients?
This is Lucy here. We are technically not allowed to suggest a specific method, but you can go to the GFCO website to get a list of approved test kits. I can say that we commonly see people testing ingredients with those test kits in-house more commonly than we see them being sent out to labs. But we technically are not allowed to suggest a specific test kit, but there are some on the gluten-free GFCO website that are listed out, and they're all relatively similar. Some of them have take a little bit longer than others, but it's generally the same procedure.
Okay, here's a question from Elliot. Is it possible to stack audits if we decide to use your services? And the answer is absolutely. Right now, we're definitely offering a discount for bundled audits, and we actually may be able to provide you with the same auditor for non-GMO, gluten-free, and organic over multiple years. So that is definitely an option.
So there's a question about ATP swabs not being considered a credible test. And that is true. I think GFCO has a great document about why ATP tests are not sufficient for gluten-free certification. And again, I'm going to refer to this GFCO approved test kits document that's available. If you just search GFCO approved test kits on Google, this should pop right up as one of the first answers, and that has information on approved test kits and why ATP is not sufficient. So there's a question about if this presentation was based on legal requirements in North America, and a lot of governments have, they allow self-made gluten-free claims. So you might have seen some products in supermarkets that say, you know, gluten-free, but aren't that GF certification. But self-made claims are technically allowed. I think generally consumers are relatively aware that they are not as strict as GFCO, and they can be kind of unregulated self-made claims in a way. But technically, in order for something to be labeled in the US as gluten-free, it does have to test less than 20 parts per million of gluten in the finished product. GFCO, again, I'm sure Evan covered this, is less than 10 parts per million. And the reason that GFCO has picked that number as opposed to the more lenient 20 parts per million is because they have detected some irritation or levels of issue with gluten at a rate of greater than 10 but less than 20 parts per million in people with celiac disease. So that's why they're working with 10 parts per million as opposed to the federal 20 parts per million.
And I think that also applies to the question, does the plant have to have the GFCO certification to be able to put the gluten-free on the label of the product? So if they want to use the GFCO gluten-free logo, then absolutely. But if they want to put some kind of generic gluten-free claim on there, as Lucy just mentioned, it may only apply to 20 parts per million, whereas GFCO is 10 parts per million. And what countries is GFC certification available for?
I think pretty much all countries. We do have, you know, I think technically most countries you are able to use it. There might be a few exceptions to that list. And then, you know, we'd have auditors based all over the world. So just depending on the specific region, we would be able to accommodate in different geographical areas. And the cost of certification. So the cost of certification is based on the risk level of the facility as well as the number of products you produce. So our fee schedule is, I would say, generally ends up being somewhere around $2,600 to $2,800 for the average operation. That does increase if you have multiple facilities. That does increase if you have more than 10 products. But if you're within 10 products, and then if you're, you know, bundling with other programs or things like that, or have a previous gluten-free certification and you're wishing to switch over to SCS, we are offering a discount for that as well. But generally, annual costs are somewhere between $2,600 to $2,800 for most operations. So there's a question about using a shared commercial kitchen and producing gluten-free product in that shared commercial kitchen as opposed to a dedicated facility. And you do not need a dedicated facility. We can and have certified clients who work in a shared commercial kitchen. What we're really going to be focusing on if you're in a shared commercial kitchen is adequate clean out. We'll have you do some equipment swabbing to make sure that the clean out was done effectively and there are no traces of gluten in your facility. So we'll have you do some equipment swabbing in multiple places before you're producing your gluten-free product. So it definitely is possible. It will require some diligence on your end to make sure that there is no gluten contamination. We'll be heavily reviewing the storage of your ingredients and everything that you do, as well as, you know, clean out procedures from when other folks are there, making sure that any you know, wheat flour is stored in a closed container, so there's no dust issues, things like that, and mitigating all of the contamination issues there, but definitely possible to be producing product in a shared commercial kitchen. And then I saw another question about oats and growing oats on a farm. And obviously, I think, you know, oats, I think you mentioned in your question, share a lot of the supply chain steps with wheat. So there is oats are considered a risk level 4, which is the highest level of risk allowed in a certified gluten-free product. And so, we again will be looking at swabbing some of that if you're using any shared equipment for harvesting both wheat and oats, and also testing those oats before they're being sold to make sure that there is no gluten on them. So that it's possible, but it definitely is going to require diligence, testing, and making sure that there is no contamination. There's a question if this applies to restaurants, and I do not believe that this does apply to restaurants. I think that this is only for products being sold as opposed, in a retail or wholesale setting as opposed to restaurants.
So Suzanne, you followed up with, so we could use the same combine and bins that we do for wheats and oats as long as we test it and make sure it's clean. So yes, as long as you're cleaning and validating that cleaning, then theoretically, yes, you could. And another question about GFCO certification available for specifically outside of the USA. So far, I think pretty much
definitely
anywhere.
possible.
Yeah.
We have, it is in terms of getting the certification done, we will have to work with our auditing team to make sure we have someone who can do your audit in that region. But in terms of being able to get certified, there, as far as I know, there are no geographical limitations.
And also there was a question, is this presentation based on legal requirements for North America? If yes, which one? So this presentation is just based on the GFCO standard. So this isn't really a legislative thing, it's an optional third-party verification. So all the information from here, these are requirements set forth by the most recent GFCO standard. Yes, if a customer wants to combine certifications, we can absolutely combine it to make it easier. Like I mentioned before, we can even assign you the same auditor, possibly over multiple years.
Yeah, very likely that we'll be able to, especially with non-GMO and or organic, with the potential of food safety as well. We're working on cross-training auditors who work in food safety right now to also offer gluten-free, if you're interested in food safety certification. But definitely 100% with organic and non-GMO, we'll be able to bundle your audits and give you one point of contact for coordination, as well as one point of contact for the actual auditing. And we'll be able to cover a lot of those components during one on-site visit with one auditor and one contact. And you'll also get a discount on both services. So we got a question about annual compliance and if this is a one-time thing or an annual thing, and this is an annual audit. So each year, the facilities producing your product will be required to get that on-site inspection and go through the renewal process. So year to year, it will be a very similar process.
So another question was, how long does the actual site inspection take? And it can be as little as 3 hours. Usually I think it's around about half a day or so.
Yeah, usually anywhere between, I think, 2 to 6 hours is the span I've seen, but generally I would say average about 3 hours. Obviously if you have a huge operation with a ton of products and a lot of questions and incomplete policies and things that we need to review, it can take a bit longer. But the more organized you are, the faster we tend to get through these audits.
And as far as the whole audit process from contact to certification, the length of time for that would be 2 to 3 months, I would say. We also do offer expedited services. So if it's something that you need to get done within a month or so, that is also a possibility.
Yeah, we have flexibility to come quickly if necessary to do the on-site inspection, but generally we see the process taking anywhere from 2 to 3 months. There are a couple things we need from you to start the process and schedule the on-site and everything like that. So, provided that we are able to get all of that documentation, it's usually about 2 to 3 months from start to finish. And we've received quite a few questions about testing and frequencies and things like that as well. And so did you go over frequencies, I'm guessing? Yeah, so Evan went over frequencies required for ingredients and finished good products. And I also just wanted to note that there are possible ways to reduce the testing requirements. So for example, if your finished good product, if you have to test, let's say once per lot, if you're getting negative tests for, you know, I think it's 6 months or 20 consecutive lots produced, then your testing schedule will step down from once per lot down to once per day that you're producing product. And from there, it can be further reduced after, you know, a year or 40 runs to once per week, eventually to once per month, eventually to once per quarter. So if you're doing all of this finished good product testing and for a period of time or however many, you know, tests are required, whichever comes first, if they're all negative, then your testing requirements will be reduced, which means less testing and less money spent on, you know, submitting to labs or test kits. So there definitely is a step down option there. And then for ingredients, if you're receiving, let's say, oats, for example, that are already certified gluten-free, your testing requirement can be reduced with submission of that documentation. So if you have documentation saying, you know, these oats test at less than 10 parts per million, or these oats are certified gluten-free, that will reduce your requirements for that ingredient testing as well. So there are ways to reduce the testing amount that you have to do for products and ingredients.
Okay, so it doesn't look like we're getting any more questions, but if you have any more questions or anything at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to Ned, and his contact information is right up here on the screen. And we'll also be sending you a copy of the webinar tomorrow. So if there aren't any more questions, we'll go ahead and close the meeting. Thank you, everybody, for joining.